Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you all for being so understanding and flexible about the need to change the date for this program from last Wednesday, a day which will surely live in infamy, to today. And a special thank you to our speakers and moderator tonight for fitting us back into their schedules during this extraordinarily demanding and especially difficult week for people in their line of work. You are all most gracious. Now for a few introductory words from my terrific, smart, and hardworking partner, David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. It's a pleasure to welcome you all once again to our America at Crossroads series, our weekly exploration of where our nation is and where we're going with our country's most thoughtful and analytical leaders and thinkers. I speak on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates Inc., the creators and hosts of this series, and our leadership team of former Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, former Congressman Mel Levine, Rabbi Ken Chasen, Caroline Kelly, and the person you just heard for, Janice Kaminer-Resnick. Our co-sponsors, there are nearly a dozen of them: ICAR, the Jewish Center for Justice, Leo Beck Temple, Stephen Weiss Temple, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Beth Am, Temple Isaiah, LA Museum of the Holocaust, the Pico Union Project, and our newest partner, the American Jewish Committee, Los Angeles chapter. This week was historic. After the unprecedented Georgia vote on Tuesday came 36 hours of some of the most extraordinary events in recent American history: the incendiary speech by President Trump, the march to the Capitol, and then the violence committed on the Congress and its seat of power. Considering what has transpired, we are beyond fortunate to have two of the most respected analysts of events in Washington, of the occupant of the White House, and what it all means, joining us this evening. Our two guests will be able to help set the week's events in their historic context, as they recently authored an acclaimed bestseller, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James Baker, so they know from whence they speak. Please order a copy. It is a terrific book. I wish you all a very happy, healthy, and safe new year. This year, and especially here in Los Angeles, the wish has special meaning. Now, my wonderful partner, Janice Kaminer-Resnick, with whom has been a joy to collaborate these past 10 months. She's a remarkable and tireless leader. Janice?
Susan Glasser is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes a weekly column on life in Trump's Washington. Susan Glasser has served as the top editor of several Washington publications. Most recently, she founded the award-winning Politico magazine, which many of us read, and served as editor of Politico through the 2016 election cycle. She previously served as editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, which won 3 National Magazine Awards, among other honors during her tenure. Before that, she worked for a decade at the Washington Post. Her books include Kremlin Rising and The Man Who Ran Washington, about James A. Baker, that David has mentioned, both of which she co-wrote with her husband, Peter Baker. Susan is a graduate of Harvard University, where she wrote for the Crimson Tide. She is a frequent commentator on CNN and many other news outlets. I'm sure if those of you who are watching the news today or any of the news programs saw both of our speakers multiple times on various stations today. And Susan shares a birthday with my grandson, Theo. So I know it's just about time to wish you and your son happy birthday this week. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Peter joined the Times in 2008 after 20 years at the Post, in which he covered the White House under Presidents Clinton and Bush. Peter has authored or co-authored a total of 6 books, almost all of which were bestsellers and earned awards or special recognition. Mr. Baker has won all 3 major awards devoted to White House reporting: the Gerald R. Ford Prize for distinguished coverage of the presidency, which he won twice, the Aldo Beckman Memorial Award, which he won twice, and the Merriman Smith Memorial Award. Peter has extensive Foreign Bureau experience, having served as the Jerusalem Bureau Chief for the Times and for the Post, among many other foreign assignments. He was also embedded with U.S. Marines as they advanced towards Baghdad. Peter is a political analyst for MSNBC and a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week. He attended Oberlin College. Susan and Peter spent 4 years as Moscow bureau chiefs for the Post, chronicling, among other historic events, the rise of Vladimir Putin, the rollback of Russian democracy, and the Second Chechen War. So we're very excited to have both of you tonight. And Warren Olney is our moderator for nearly 50 years. Warren, now I've revealed chronology. For nearly 50 years, Warren Olney has been a fixture in Los Angeles broadcast journalism. He's best known to us in Los Angeles for his 24 years as the host for KCRW's signature daily local news interview program, Which Way LA, which he began in the aftermath of the 1992 LA riots. Prior to that, he was reporter and anchor on local TV stations, all of them. He also taught broadcast journalism at USC. In 2000, Warren started the national broadcast To the Point, which ran on public radio stations until 2018. Since then, he has been podcasting the program, and he's preparing to launch another podcast, which he may have recently launched, about the environment and climate change. Olney and his programs have been honored with more than 40 awards, including Emmys and Golden Mics. We're very pleased to have you back with us tonight, and now I turn the program over to our amazing Warren Olney.
Janice, thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction. And Peter and Susan, welcome aboard. It's a privilege for me to be able to talk to you, and thanks a lot for doing this.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. It's the first time we've ever had an event canceled due to a coup.
I just have to hold up the book. It is called, as was said, The Man Who Ran Washington. It's about James Baker. And I think what's interesting about it is that, well, first of all, it took 250 interviews in 7 years in order to do it. But it's not just about the past, but it's about how we got where we are today. And so it is very relevant to some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. Although I think the urgency does obviously impinge upon us. And so, Peter, let me go to you first as the White House reporter. It's 8 o'clock in the evening in Washington, D.C. What have you been able to learn about how President Trump spent his day?
Well, that's a great question. Well, first of all, Warren, thank you very much for doing this. Thank you to the organization for having us and inviting us. We've been lucky to do Warren's show in the past. The first time I've actually ever gotten to see Warren in person, if you will, at least visually. So this is a great treat for us. We wish we could be there in person. It's been a quiet weekend at the White House, if nothing else, because the president has found his favorite bullhorn taken away from him. He has been suspended, as everybody knows, from Twitter. When he tried to get around it using other accounts over the last couple of days, they suspended those as well and blocked him. It's sort of like a whack-a-mole kind of game at this point. And otherwise, he's been basically holed up at the White House, out of public sight, silent, stewing over his fate, angry at almost everyone, including his own vice president, and making plans for his last 10 days in office. Now, what those will look like, we're not sure, but they announced today he's going to go to Texas on Tuesday to talk about border security. And he's planning other events to try to highlight what he considers to be his accomplishments, which is rather striking because, of course, it's almost ignoring the big giant elephant in the room, which is the House of Representatives preparing to impeach him for inciting the mob that ransacked the Capitol last week.
Let me go to you, Susan, and tell us, if you will, what the current plans are by Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the Democrats that are now in charge of the House.
It's an evolving situation. I think that Democrats are very united when it comes to feeling that they have to have a vote, they have to speak with one voice, and that there must be some accountability for this. However, it's not obvious to them exactly what should do, because a second impeachment has a lot of logistical challenges to it, not least of which are that it's actually, in practical terms, basically impossible to both impeach him and have a Senate trial before Joe Biden's inauguration on January 20th. And so what they're doing right now is Nancy Pelosi, just right before this conversation, put out a letter to her members, and in which she said a couple things. One, she said, we are moving ahead with votes tomorrow. That's Monday. They're going to introduce and seek unanimous consent for a resolution from Congressman Jamie Raskin that would begin to trigger the congressional portion of the 25th Amendment. And then they're going to give Vice President Mike Pence 24 hours to see if Pence will convene a majority of the cabinet and agree to remove Trump via the 25th Amendment. That, of course, is highly unlikely, if not extremely unlikely at this point. And they probably won't get unanimous consent. So that will probably move over into Tuesday. She said that if after 24 hours, Vice President Pence has not moved on the 25th Amendment, then the House will proceed with impeachment. They have drafted an article of impeachment, as everybody knows. So people on the Hill expect that you could see this second impeachment vote on Wednesday, or perhaps later in the week. But I think Wednesday right now looks like what we might see. But this is a really moving target. There's genuine concern among Democrats about this balancing act between holding Trump in some way accountable, putting on the record that this is unacceptable behavior, and also recognizing, that there's the political complications of making a symbolic gesture if there's going to be a Senate trial that's hanging over Joe Biden's beginning of his presidency.
Peter, is there even enough members of the cabinet at this point who have been confirmed by the Senate who could actually get together and provide the necessary votes to accomplish the 25th Amendment if Vice President Pence chose to go that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. Under the 25th Amendment, it has to be the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. Now, it says what it says actually are the heads, the principal officers of the executive departments. That's been interpreted to mean the 15 statutory cabinet agencies. But we've seen this week alone and last week, two of them just to resign in protest of the events on Wednesday. The Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, and Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. So we're already down those two. A number of the other ones are acting secretaries, and there's some debate as to whether acting secretaries would have a role in this. But I think that if the vice president decided that the 25th Amendment should be invoked, my guess is enough of the cabinet would go along with him, because I think that leadership is what the rest of them would look toward. He's not likely to do it. He's told people that he doesn't think it's a good idea. It's an unwieldy mechanism. Remember, it is a clause meant to deal with a disability by the president. It really wasn't meant, or at least envisioned, for this necessarily kind of situation. And the president can appeal it to the Congress. There's a whole mechanism that's very complicated. But I think it's mainly a way of Nancy Pelosi putting the pressure on Mike Pence and giving her members a couple days to gather in Washington to be able to have their vote, which, as Susan said, probably will be Wednesday.
A couple other things I should point out. Because this is so uncertain and nothing like this has ever happened before in the history of our country, there are two other possibilities. Nancy Pelosi's letter for the first time did mention, I don't know if you noticed this, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which was passed during Reconstruction, actually prohibits anyone from serving as president of the United States who has engaged in an act of insurrection or has aided and abetted those who did. And so there is actually an argument among historians and legal scholars. Eric Foner, for example, the Columbia historian of the Reconstruction, has pointed this out. There's an argument that already this is prohibited both by the Constitution, and there's actually then a federal statute that was written to enact that provision of the Constitution. So there is some discussion of that among Democratic members of Congress. And in fact, Pelosi cited that in her letter. She said that's something they're discussing. And Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the DC delegate, she introduced the first censure resolution. That would not be an either or. You could certainly introduce a bipartisan, bicameral censure resolution and then still proceed with impeachment, right? So you could do these things. Right now, Democrats don't feel like censure is enough of a sanction, but it's certainly something that they would get a large majority, probably of both the House and the Senate, to sign on to.
And the charge, as I understand it, of the resolution that's going to be introduced tomorrow is incitement to insurrection. Is that the only charge that they're thinking about bringing against him? Because there are plenty of other things that he might, in fact, be held responsible for. Incitement to insurrection, I assume, would refer principally to what happened last Wednesday.
Yeah, they're going to file one article, a single article of impeachment that, as you say, is charging incitement to insurrection. In the text of the article as it is currently drafted, and it could change, they do cite some other actions on his part, in particular, for instance, the phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State that many people heard when the tape was released last week. And they make the argument that that was part and parcel of a broader pattern to obstruct a democratic election that culminated with this mob attack on the Capitol. So they're trying to make the case that the incitement at that rally was part of a broader crime, if you will, and in their interpretation anyway, against democracy. But the one charge really is the incitement. And the one thing that's different about this impeachment than the one we had even a year ago is everybody's a witness. There are 300 million witnesses to this at this point. I mean, this happened in front of everybody's eyes on television. People can judge for themselves whether the president's words were incitement or not. They can judge for themselves whether or not they think that he ought to be held accountable in the way that the House is talking about. There's not really that much of a need for witnesses because, in fact, everybody knows what happened.
And of course, we've also witnessed what happened in the Capitol. A lot of new footage released today about how extraordinarily violent that really was. Peter, back to you. You said that the president you described him as kind of a lonely guy in the office, described, I gather, by his own staff as desperate. He's deprived of Twitter and his other ways of directly reaching the mass audience that he craves. As I understand it, some credit card companies now are not allowing contributions to his post-election campaign. Is there any evidence that he's trying to reach out to supporters or to Confederates of some kind in other ways that we haven't heard about?
Yeah, there's so many consequences that are sort of spilling out by the day. You know, there's this discussion today that the PGA, for instance, might take away the golf championship that's scheduled to be at his Bedminster Golf Club in 2022. There are big companies that are starting to say we're not going to contribute money from now on to any of the Republican congressmen or senators who voted to block Joe Biden's electors on Wednesday after that mob attack. The president is increasingly in a smaller and smaller circle of people that he's listening to. You know, he's over the last 10 weeks, he basically shut out more and more the people who told him that he ought to concede and move on to an orderly transition, and listened only to the conspiracy theorists who were telling him all the different ways that he could say that he had lost the election because of theft. And I think that there's sort of a, fewer people he wants to hear from and listen to, but he's calling around to allies. He's asking them, well, how bad do you think it is? What do you think we can do about it? He's trying to rally, at least to some extent, the most loyal people around him to fight impeachment. And we'll see if that goes anywhere. I think that the resistance to impeachment by Republicans will not be defending Donald Trump. It will not be saying that that was a perfect phone call, to coin a phrase. They will not say he did it, what he did was the right thing or even acceptable. But the defense will be, is this really what we want to spend our time with at this point? It's only divisive. It's further polarizing the country. Let's go ahead and move on to the inauguration since it's only 10 days away.
Susan Glasser, how worried are you? How seriously do you take the warnings about round two on the 17th of this month or the 19th and 20th of this month, or whenever it might occur, by the same people who attacked the Capitol on Wednesday?
Yeah, well, I take it very seriously, but more importantly, I hope that the law enforcement takes it very seriously. And one of the more disquieting things, I think, for us being here in Washington right now is recognizing sometimes the scandal is what doesn't happen. And what hasn't happened in Washington, D.C. since this terrible attack on the Capitol is almost as terrifying as what did happen in those moments. Because the truth is, our government, as you know it, as I know it, has stopped to function. And we've never been in a situation where, since this attack on the Capitol of the United States, the symbol of American democracy, there has not been a single briefing by federal law enforcement agencies. There's been no press conference. There's been no ability to ask questions of the Capitol Police who let this horror occur. There's been no ability for anyone to ask questions of what's going to happen next to make sure that we're prepared. And the basic chain of accountability in this country has been ruptured. The president, it took him until today even to lower the White House flags to half-mast in honor of the Capitol Police who died. And now we're up to 2 dead Capitol Police. A second officer died today who was participating in the response to the attack last Wednesday. And we have not heard, any leadership basically from our law enforcement agencies. After a 9/11, remember and think about what happened in this country. It was a terrible attack, but at least you had the government functioning in response to it every single day. You had the Pentagon briefing, you had the White House briefing, you had a sense that there was going to be steps taken to uncover what happened. You've seen none of that. You've not seen the acting attorney general. And remember, the attorney general, even Bill Barr, got off the Trump train right before Christmas and left office December 23rd after saying publicly there was no evidence whatsoever to support the president's false claims of fraud in the election. We've not heard from the acting attorney general. He's given no press conferences. We've not heard from the acting defense secretary. What was the first thing Donald Trump did after the election that he lost decisively? He fired the Secretary of Defense because the Secretary of Defense had been standing up to him since, you remember, the attack on Lafayette Square, when in contrast, to what happened last week at the US Capitol. They used overwhelming police force and militarized force to clear peaceful protesters away in order to have a photo op for the president. So it's been a very disquieting moment. So yes, I'm very concerned about there are indications that the same group of people are saying we're going to be back with more weapons. They're still beginning to uncover the extent to which this wasn't just a mob with funny costumes, but this was a highly planned and orchestrated attack on the Capitol by people, it looks like former and possibly some current law enforcement personnel from around the country were participating in this attack on our Capitol. It appears that they had explosives, not just the two that we know about at the DNC and the RNC. There was a lot of weapons. So I think, again, this is a bigger crisis in some ways, as we now understand it, than we did even as it was unfolding on Wednesday afternoon.
The things you describe remind one of what was said on Wednesday, not just by the president, but also by Rudy Giuliani and by other associates of the president, telling people it's time to go to war. Essentially, that's a rough paraphrase, but I don't think it's off the point at all. What about the warnings? It's my understanding that the current Secretary of Defense was one who, when he was asked to mobilize the National Guard by the mayor of Washington, D.C., was reluctant to do it or refused to do it. And that's one of the reasons that, despite all of the warnings that we've had, not just on Wednesday, but for weeks before that, by all of these groups and all of their various websites, that such a thing might happen.
Well, there's a lot of, sort of confusion on this point, but actually I've spoken with senior Pentagon officials, and actually that's not the case. Really what we're seeing here in some ways is the terrible consequence and fallout from that Battle of Lafayette Square back in June, right? There was an enormous and very justified fear, I must tell you, among Mayor Bowser in DC and also at the senior levels of the Pentagon, did not want to be pulled into this. In fact, they've been very afraid since the election, extremely afraid that Donald Trump was going to manufacture some kind of violence in the streets in order to call on the military, in order to invoke the Insurrection Act. So I think part of the problem is that the military at the top levels were concerned about this scenario. Mayor Bowser was concerned about this scenario, not wanting to have this enormous militarized footprint. Whatever the tragic reasons for it, the result was that actually 3 days before this happened, according to a timeline put out by the Pentagon and also according to my own reporting, 3 days before this happened, DC actually turned down when the Pentagon said, "Don't you want the National Guard mobilized?" She said, "No, I want," and she gave, I think it was 300 guards people that she said she wanted, and she had very specific roles that she specified. The Capitol Police also turned down. They were also asked, directly by the Pentagon, "Don't you want more support?" No, the Capitol Police chief said, and by the way, he directly lied to at least 2 members of Congress who publicly come forward, Maxine Waters from Los Angeles and also Zoe Lofgren from California, who is in charge of the appropriations subcommittee that works on this. He lied apparently to both of them and said that they were going to have the National Guard, but in fact, they had said no. So what's the confusion is that in the immediate moment, then on Wednesday, when the Capitol is being overrun, of course, Mayor Bowser and members of Congress are frantically calling the Pentagon, calling the acting Secretary of Defense. And at that moment, he did not have a mobilized contingent ready to send up right away. They did send the military that was asked for, and they arrived within 2.5 hours of when they were finally mobilized. But that's the confusion, I think, that there is. And it's all part of the tragedy that needs to be investigated, really by a sort of 9/11 style commission.
So, Peter, there is all this unhappiness and dissatisfaction about the difficulty of trying to take action with regard to President Trump, whether it's resignation, which he's not likely to go along with, or the 25th Amendment, or impeachment, which you incidentally co-authored a history book about, I should point out. What about Joe Biden trying to take office as all of this is going on? And the suggestion made by James Clyburn that, well, what we could do is make the charge of the incitement to insurrection now, and then wait 100 days and let Biden get underway before we actually have a trial. Is that a reasonable suggestion?
Well, again, everybody's spitballing because we've never come across a scenario quite like this. But you're right. There's a lot of concern about whether or not this would suddenly try to upend the opening days of Biden's presidency. If the Senate can't get a trial going until January 19th, January 20th, the last thing a new president wants is to have his predecessor being put on trial at the same time he's trying to move forward, start a new government, and in fact get hands around a crisis that's killing 3,000 to 4,000 Americans every day. Right, we're having a horrific death toll from this coronavirus that is not under control, and that we need our government focused on. But right now, of course, that's very difficult. So yes, I mean that's what they're trying to do with this idea that Clyburn talked about. The idea that going ahead and impeach him, Democrats have enough votes to do that. They already have 200 and I think 20. They already have more.
They have enough.
They have enough votes to go ahead and impeach him, but hold back the articles. Now, if they don't, under the rules, once the House delivers the articles to the Senate has to convene the trial at 1 p.m. the next day. Right. So the way to do it would be to hold back the delivery. That's what Clyburn is talking about. We'll deliver it in a couple months, in 3 months, 4 months. Now, people say, well, wait a second, how do you put somebody on trial who's no longer in office? You can't throw him out of office if he's already gone, which is a fair question. And there is some constitutional debate about this. Could you put on trial a former official rather than just official? And why would you want to? Well, there'd be two reasons why. First of all, one, of course, is to get the stamp of disapproval for the sake of history, to say, as a matter of the historical record, Congress of the United States says that you are not worthy of holding this office. And the second is that another penalty in the Constitution, other than removing from office, is forbidding somebody from holding office ever again, which means that Donald Trump could not run in 2024 if he wanted to, if they applied that penalty. Now, can you be tried after you leave office? Again, there's some debate about this, but there is also a precedent. There was a Secretary of War under Ulysses Grant who's being investigated for corruption. The House is about to impeach him, and minutes before, he rushes to the White House and he turns in his resignation, thinking that that would keep him from being impeached. The House says, forget that, we're going to impeach you anyway, and they did. And then the Senate went ahead and put him on trial. Now, they acquitted him, but by putting him on trial, they said, we have the right to put you on trial, even if you're no longer in office. So I think that there's some precedent for that.
You have to reach far back in history to find precedents for the current situation that we are dealing with. Susan, you have said very emphatically that there must be accountability for the kinds of crimes and infractions that the president and his enablers are accused of. What's the alternative? What about people who say, look, this is only going to make things worse. It's going to get 74 million people who voted for Trump angrier than they might already be. And it's time to simply move on and get going with a new administration. And actually, we've got COVID to worry about in the first place.
Well, look, Warren, I understand that. I think that's a common refrain. And frankly, there's a pressure from both the left and the right to move on. And that was the case even before the horrific events of last Wednesday. Remember that Donald Trump has now, essentially allowed hundreds of thousands of Americans to die over the last year on his watch, while seeming not to care about it and doing many things that have made that pandemic significantly worse. That alone is worthy of a major 9/11 style investigation, it seems to me. But, I think that you don't have to be a historian to know that even the most basic lesson of history is that there cannot be reconciliation and moving on unless a society has had both accountability and a reckoning for what has gone on. That is a recipe for future disaster in the society. And, again, accountability can take different forms. I think there's a very legitimate debate going on right now about impeachment and whether that's the best way to deal with this or not. And I'm lucky I'm a journalist. I don't have to come up with the solutions. So I think that the debate about impeachment, this is very awkward. What Peter's just outlining, I mean, really, we're going to have a trial 100 days after, the Biden presidency. It seems very awkward. So I don't think it's obvious what kind of accountability is needed. I think the lessons of history, however, are crystal clear that accountability there must be if we as a society are not to remain vulnerable to something like this happening again. And just actually to the point about could Trump be barred from office? And isn't that the real goal of this impeachment and a trial conviction? I think that's why I find the discussion about the 14th Amendment so interesting, and a possible way around this need for an impeachment trial. It's possible some experts, again, this has never happened, so who knows, right? But some experts believe that Congress could pass a law that says that he could not be eligible to run for president again, having determined that he was in a state of insurrection or inciting and aiding and giving comfort to those who were in insurrection to the United States, because that would, by the way, would only take 51 votes potentially, rather than 2/3 majority of the Senate. So, I don't know what form the accountability needs to take, but I feel that it's very, very clear that history shows us that something must be done about this, and to restore the rule of law and to restore America as a rule of law country. I think it's just fundamental to our future standing in the world as well as domestically.
You're talking so far just about accountability on the part of the president, but he has an enormous number of enablers and has for the past 4 years. 147 Republicans in the House and the Senate voted to overturn valid election results. I don't know if that specifically is a crime. It's, I guess, something that they can do or attempt to do. They were unable to accomplish it. But how far do you have to go for accountability? How many people do you have to include before you can really be satisfied that there's a possibility that this might not happen again?
Well, it's a good question. It's one that people are wrestling with both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party. There's a lot of, you hear talk in Washington about, well, should so-and-so senator or congressman even be seated anymore if they are in league in effect with this illegitimate effort to overturn the election? I don't think that will go anywhere, but I think it's part of the conversation. It tells you how deep the anger is right now. And the Democratic side, especially, there has been this debate even before that last Wednesday about how far they should go in terms of post-inauguration justice, if you will, because there's a worry about looking like victor's justice. There's a worry about, the reason why Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon was not because Richard Nixon deserved to have amnesty, but because Gerald Ford didn't want his presidency to be taken up with it, or didn't want the country to be torn apart by it. A lot of people disagree with him at the time, helped probably cost him his election in 1976, but history over time gave him more credit for that. There's a real palpable anger this time, though, and there's a lot of Democrats, especially since last Wednesday, who are saying that cannot be the answer here, and there are enablers. You see consequences in other ways. Simon & Schuster decided, for instance, to take away the book contract for Senator Josh Hawley, who was the leader in the Senate of the effort to block the electors for Biden. And as I said, some of the companies saying they're no longer going to contribute to those who joined that effort. But it's a very volatile moment in that sense. And I think that nobody has a real clear sense of what's going to happen in that regard.
The Democrats are divided, as always. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who says the Republicans can do all this because they don't believe the Democrats have the stones to play hardball like they do. I suspect that's an edited version of what she actually said. But what's happened to the Republican Party? What is it at the moment? They didn't have a platform when Trump ran for a re-election, and they have just re-elected the chairwoman who headed the party at that time. Do they stand for anything?
Well, up until this week, they stand for Donald Trump. And what you see is on his way out the door, Trump is essentially torching the party that he never really belonged to before he went into politics anyways. And yet, he executed a very, very successful hostile takeover of the GOP, such that, as you pointed out, there wasn't even a party platform, which is an unprecedented thing. It literally means that the party's ideology was whatever Donald Trump said it was. So now you see those fissures coming back into focus. And I think on his way out the door, arguably Donald Trump torched the Senate majority. We sort of lost sight of that because of these dramatic and important events. But it was on Wednesday itself that it was becoming clear that Democrats had managed to win back the Senate because of the two runoff races in Georgia. And really, you got to look at what happened there and think that Donald Trump is the one who made that happen for the Democrats by telling Republican voters in Georgia that the election was rigged, that you shouldn't trust it, by making it all about him and not the two candidates. Republicans wanted to make that a campaign in which they argued we need to elect these two Republicans as a bulwark against a sort of out of control liberal government where Biden can't keep the far left in check because all three branches of government are controlled. That's a pretty obvious Republican campaign platform, but they had a huge problem with that. You'd have to acknowledge that Joe Biden was going to be the president, and Donald Trump wouldn't allow them, or they went along with him in refusing to acknowledge it. And so ironically, you have this situation where Mitch McConnell's now finally broken with Trump and said, no, I recognize the results of the election. But the truth is that it's a fascinating situation here where the enabling of Trump for all these years is actually what destroyed what they cared about the most. Certainly what Mitch McConnell cared about the most, which was being the Senate Majority Leader. That's the only job he ever wanted in life. He just destroyed his own Senate majority by going along with Donald Trump's unconstitutional challenge to the election. And so there is this sort of, Shakespearean almost, I called it the Trumperdamarum, the bonfire of the vanities, that he's going out and sort of blowing it all up on the way out the door.
Wonderful that you mentioned the elections in Georgia, because one has to wonder to what extent what we're seeing is a reaction, not just to that, which of course occurred only the day before the attack occurred on the Capitol, but to the recognition that we have seen of institutionalized racism in the United States, Black Lives Matter, the police shooting of the civilians and by police who were people of color, and what that reveals about America and the extent to which this is a backlash of some kind to the fact that we are moving in the direction we are, like it or not, demographically, and that's going to mean a big change in politics.
Yeah, that's certainly right, and certainly that fuels a lot of what's going on. Not everybody necessarily, but it's hard to look at the pictures of the Capitol and see the Confederate flag being flown on the inside of the Capitol when that never happened during the Civil War. The Confederates never got anywhere near the Capitol in the 1860s, and here we are in the 2020s, and that flag was being touted through the building. You saw people with shirts like Camp Auschwitz. You saw, what was the 6 million is not enough. So not everybody there was necessarily like that, but obviously there was enough of that flavored and came to dominate a lot of what was seen and as the message of that event. This was in fact, a crowd that was promoting hate, and it reflected a very dangerous strain in the American population right now. Certainly, a number of members of Congress who were there, who were African American, who were Jewish, who were known as foils of the president, like Adam Schiff, were either worried or they were told that they were being targeted by some of these folks. That they were walking through there. This is a question of race, but they were walking through there looking for Mike Pence because the president told them they should be mad at Mike Pence for not trying to use power they didn't have to stop the election result. They were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and a gallows was set up on the exterior of the Capitol, which is of course resonant of the Old South. And so it's hard to separate these things right now, and it's a very troubling display of hate right there in the middle of a democracy.
I treasure my opportunity to talk to you guys and to ask you questions. And Peter, thanks for acknowledging your appearance on my podcast from time to time. I hope you'll both do that in the future. But I do need to give our audience an opportunity to ask questions. They were promised that. I think there are a lot of them. And I'm getting on my Twitter feed from David a whole lot of questions. And one of them sort of goes to the book that you have written, although in a sort of indirect way. Gloria wants to know, how do we unpolarize the country?
If only we could, wave a magic wand. Look, polarization obviously predates Donald Trump. This sclerotic, gridlock, dysfunctional moment in Washington didn't begin with Donald Trump. In fact, when Peter and I started our book on Jim Baker 7 years ago in the dim mists of the Obama era, It was already with the idea that what had happened to Washington was going to be a key, almost a character in the book, along with Baker, because it was so clearly a different moment in time, a moment when the ability and the structural incentives to work across the aisle between Democrats and Republicans had gone from being, in fact, a sort of an obligation of political success that you couldn't hope to win re-election unless you did things like that to accomplish deals, had gone from that to actually being an obstacle to political success. And so I say that only because it's also true that the last 4 years have done, I think, incalculable damage to the country. And this, I think, is an example where there are certainly structural reasons for this division, and it also makes a huge difference to have a divider and not a uniter as the president. And so, look, Joe Biden is a different kind of a politician. He's continued to hold to the idea that he's going to be the president for all of the country after 4 years of a president for part of the country. It's been made even more challenging because of these recent events. But I think that words do matter, as we're seeing. And so I wouldn't give up hope. There are certain things that there are actually large majorities of Americans, certain policy issues that large majorities of Americans actually still agree on. So maybe they can work on that for once.
I would say what was interesting about going back and looking at Baker was to remind ourselves that it's not that times weren't divided in the past or there wasn't partisanship in the past. Of course there was. In fact, our system is built on the idea of a competition of ideas and a competition of ideology. That's not wrong. That's healthy. What's unhealthy is if that's the only thing that there is, and it becomes, as we see, taken to the extreme as it was last Wednesday. But when Baker was in office, he was a ruthless, cutthroat, political operative. And
so was Abraham Lincoln.
Well, that's right, exactly. You had to win elections, and elections aren't beanball. The difference was that after the tough elections where he would eviscerate the Democrats, he would sit down with the Democrats across the aisle and then start cutting deals to actually govern, that you could compete for office against somebody and then sit down and govern with somebody, that these were one led to the other. And as Susan says, the structural things have changed so that you are down in Washington denigrated if you do anything that would compromise with the other party. What worries me about what we've seen in the last few days even is that rather than becoming a moment that kind of shocked the system and said, hey, wait a second, maybe we all need to kind of recognize that things have gone off course and think about coming together again, we're pretty quickly, I think, I'm worrying that we would immediately head back to our partisan corners again. And rather, Republicans aren't defending, at least Republican office holders aren't defending Trump, but they are so viscerally anti the other side that if the other side starts doing stuff, we've got to start going, after them. And so I don't know what we'll see in the next week. I think Susan's right that Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, his instincts are closer to Baker's instincts, which is to say how to work with the other side. But we don't know whether that's going to be possible.
One of you or the other of you mentioned the foreign policy implications of all of this, and Judge Joe asked this: what are the ramifications of all this chaos on our foreign policy?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because Americans tend to get caught up, understandably, in the domestic chaos of a country divided, but the whole world is watching and weeping with us as well. And that really hit home, I think, on Wednesday in the middle of this, to see that world leaders literally felt compelled to speak out in the middle of this while there were still people ransacking our capital. You heard from the Secretary of General of NATO. You heard from the Prime Minister of Great Britain. You heard from Justin Trudeau in Canada, who then gave another speech about it. The world's heart is breaking for those who still care about democracy at a time when autocracies in Russia and China and elsewhere are newly rising again. This has been the Trump presidency, and then this particular sort of ending blow has just been a gut punch, really, to those who care about democracy around the world. I happen to be doing an appearance with colleagues in Germany and London the day after this occurred, and it really was almost heartbreaking to hear from Berlin, begging, saying, "Are you going to hold Donald Trump and the Republicans accountable? Is America going to be a rule of law society again? We need you to do this." And so, I think it becomes an enormous foreign policy challenge. Joe Biden talked about holding a summit of democracies when he came in to office. That was one of the things he said on the campaign trail as a way of talking about how, Trump has shown a preference for autocrats over our allies. But the problem is, how can America convene a summit of democracies when the state of our own democracy is so precarious? So I think it's a very, that's a very high altitude problem, but it's actually also a practical problem for Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, and those who will be charged with sending out the message that Biden wants to send, which is that America's back. The problem is that our credibility is diminished and if not destroyed. And it's very hard, not only because we have this problem of our instability at home, but imagine that you're Iran and we say we want to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. What confidence do you have that a new administration isn't going to come in and just get rid of it all over again? And so again, I find that this is a perilous moment on the world stage as much as it is domestically. And I don't think that gets talked about enough.
One of our listeners remembers that you've spent some time in Moscow and wants to know, what do you think Vladimir Putin is? How is he reacting to this? You can't go inside of his head, and I don't want to ask how he's thinking, but what are the implications in terms of the United States relationship with him, particularly given all that has been said and observed about his relationship with President Trump up Helsinki et al.?
Well, I have to imagine that he's not, that he's pretty happy at this moment, because what he's seeing is that, all the things that Susan just talked about, the damage to American reputation abroad is, in his view, in the zero-sum way he looks at the world, good for him and good for Russia. What Russian officials have done repeatedly, and when we were there, we heard this all the time, is look for equivalences, false equivalences, and whataboutism. So if anybody ever said to Russia, well, hey, you're cracking down on dissent, or you're treating people badly, then they say, well, you guys did this, and what about that? And they pull things out of our history and sometimes out of our current events that they try to equate to the actions that they're taking to justify what they're doing. And unfortunately, they won't be the only ones, as Susan said, around the world doing that. We will have no standing to lecture or even urge less free countries around the world to act better than they perceive us to be acting. And I think that that's for Putin, a great victory in this last week.
Marty has a question about the press. How will the press, I assume he means all of the media, deal with Trump? There's going to be a big vacuum, without Trump, I should say. There's going to be a big vacuum as a result.
Well, we look forward to, boring times, or at least not being woken up in the middle of the night and early in the morning by the buzzing of the phone saying that Trump has tweeted again. It's silence that I'm perfectly willing to live with. The truth is that the story of Trump and Trumpism actually is not going to go away, certainly not in the short term. And this is a society that is convulsed by divisions. And we have obviously a problem with violent white supremacists operating inside our society in apparently an uncontrolled way, and apparently in a way that part of our own government, part of our political class is co-opted and corrupted by. So that's not going to go away. 74 million people voted for Donald Trump in this election after hundreds of thousands of Americans died in a deadly pandemic. So, we're not going to just see that magically disappear at noon on January 20th. I really don't think so. And the other thing is that confidence in institutions, in each other, and in the work that we as journalists do is not easily rebuilt when it's been systematically attacked over a period of time. And, you certainly saw some consequences of that when, the president of the United States calling journalists enemies of the people. I hope that you will see some of the very disturbing footage that is continuing to emerge of the attacks on journalists at this mob. And that is the wages of a purposeful campaign of terror. Why? It's not just because Donald Trump doesn't like journalists personally. In fact, he actually loves, some journalists, and he loves publicity, and he loves his name in print. The reason Donald Trump and his people targeted the press and called them enemies of the people because that's from the dictator's playbook. And we saw it in Russia when we lived there. The very first thing that Vladimir Putin did after he became president of Russia was to systematically target the only independent television network that had ever existed in Russian history. And it was a prelude to his abolition and dismantling of the fragile democracy that had existed in Russia. And they targeted the media from the very beginning because that's what wannabe autocrats do.
I would add just 3 quick debates I think that are going to happen now. One is, how much attention does the media give President Trump from the outside, right? When he weighs in on things, now he won't be able to do it through Twitter, but he'll find other ways of doing it. Do we pay attention to him or not? And if so, what's the right balance there? Because you don't want to both give oxygen to things at the same time you can't ignore him, because as Susan said, he actually has a lot of support. A lot of people still actually like him, and he's part of this conversation, whether we want it to or not. The second big debate is going to be, how does the media then handle a new president, President Biden, in terms of accountability? Because what you're going to see a lot, I think, is people saying, well, wait a second, why are you so mean to Biden? We're going to explain to people, it's our job to hold anybody accountable, whether it's Trump or Biden or any other president. That doesn't mean it's going to be the same. It doesn't mean it's a false equivalence. But on the other hand, if everything that Biden does that might be different is less than what Trump does that mean he gets a free pass from the media or not? How do we find that balance to find our role as accountability agents in a new administration that will not be like the last one, but it's still important to hold accountable, because that's what we do. And the third thing I would say is, we have to find a way to reach out and get past the fragmentation of the media, because I think that if everybody only goes to the media that they think represents their point of view, that's a real problem. And that's a lot of the source of that polarization that one of your previous questions was asking.
How do you do that? How do you get rid of the fragmentation that has occurred, given all of the technology that we now have? The moment you get rid of one, a bunch of others pop up that are even worse.
I don't mean get rid of it. What I mean, though, is that there need to be, at least on the part of, say, my newspaper, for instance, and others, an effort to make sure that our brand is a brand of credibility, that we are fact-based, that we are correct in our reporting, that we are fair, and that we, in fact, find ways of telling the truth that people can rely on and trust, rather than dismiss because of partisan ideology. That's not an easy challenge, but I don't think we want to be a newspaper only for part of America. I think we want to be a newspaper that everybody can look to, because they don't know who to trust. They should be able to trust, in at least a few organizations that try not to be catering to their partisan whims, but try to provide truthful, factual, and information analysis.
Yeah, but they're already trying to provide that. The problem is, unfortunately, is not that the New York Times is not trying to offer truth and unassailable independent information to people, but that people through the lens are viewing it through the lens of partisanship and party, and are willing to accept it. Unfortunately, I don't see that getting. I don't see us getting less fragmented in the next few years.
It's all well and good to talk about being fact-based, but there are a lot of people who simply don't want to accept facts, like the people who won't wear masks, for example. A classic example of going against their own interests for reasons that, frankly, it's very difficult for other people to comprehend.
Well, Warren, I think that's an excellent point. And actually, I was on today with Jeff Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, and he spent some time with the people at the rally before it went up to the Capitol. So when they were on the Mall, and he said that he came to realize that he called it a mass delusion event. And this goes to the point about truth, that really all of those people were there because of lies and lies that they believed. And, that it wasn't for lack of the New York Times reporting facts or having credibility. But, first of all, none of them wore masks. So they don't accept that the pandemic is real. They don't accept that the public health crisis is real. They don't accept that Donald Trump lost the election. They don't accept, in fact, that was the amazing thing. If you look at a lot of these interviews, many of the journalists were asking them, why are you here? What do you want? What do you think will happen by your being here? And over again, these people said, well, yeah, we don't think that Joe Biden is going to be president on January 20th. We think Donald Trump is going to have a second term, things like that. This was a mass delusion event. Many of the leaders of this movement in storming the Capitol appear to have been QAnon supporters, which is a massive, basically insane conspiracy theory. And so, you have a large crowd of thousands of people that are brought there by untruth.
This is a less Well, a gossipy kind of question by comparison to what we've been talking about. Marcia wants to know, do you see Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump Jr. and Eric having political futures?
Less so than a week ago, right? I think that I think there was definitely an interest on some of their parts to have one. Certainly, Lara Trump has already talked about running in North Carolina, and there have been talk about whether Ivanka might. Certainly, Don Jr. seemed to harbor ambitions to. But I think that after last Wednesday, that becomes much, much harder. They're so much more radioactive than they had been before. You know, we'll see. Anything can happen. America's a constantly fluid place, but I think that their future and his future in our politics changed drastically in the last 5 days.
Back again to the media. Marshall wants to know, are you afraid for your own safety?
Well, I would say that our colleagues who were up on Capitol Hill were very, very brave, and they were very much under threat the other day. There are consequences to the president of the United States calling journalists enemies of the people, and I would say that anybody who's in Washington, D.C. Right now is somewhat scared for their own safety, because when a bunch of white supremacists come to town armed with who knows what, anything can happen. Peter and I have covered wars. I covered the Battle of Tora Bora for the Washington Post. I was not a hardened war correspondent when I did so. What I would say is that it is a real privilege to be a journalist. We never thought that these would be the kinds of questions that we were being asked about, and the kind of coverage that seemed more familiar to me, covering a disputed election in Azerbaijan than in Afghanistan than in Washington, D.C. It is felt at times the last 4 years as if we were foreign correspondents here in our own home.
It is being suggested to me that it is time for me to offer you an opportunity to make any closing statements that you want to do, and you've got 3 or 4 minutes to do it.
You go, no, oh, well, I want to say, first of all, thank you everybody for coming tonight and for being part of this conversation. I think that one of the things that's great about America is that we do have these conversations, that we do, address issues in a forthright way. And we're really grateful to you for including us. We're grateful to Warren, who's just, the best of the best at this. I usually try to end talks with a note of optimism, because in general, I'm an optimistic person. I'm an optimistic person about America. I would like to think that something good will still come out of these terrible days. The fact that the Congress went back into session just basically hours after they had been driven out of there and completed their work. They stayed up till 4 a.m. because they were not going to be intimidated. That was a bipartisan statement of resolve on their part. The vice president himself said, no, we have to do it, that we're not going to let them intimidate us. I think that speaks well. I hope that shows a greater resilience of our system, that for all the tests and the challenges we're facing right now, that we will in fact still find our way forward. And that's my hope. And I'm glad that people here on this call are going to, I think, hopefully be part of the conversation that gets us there.
Susan, are you optimistic?
Well,
now for the rebuttal.
Look, let's just hope that this is more of the hangover from 2020. The fact that there is a vaccine is incredible good news. The fact that it arrived so quickly is incredible good news. The fact that the system, as Peter pointed out, did hold. 93 senators voted to affirm Joe Biden's victory. Now, of course, this shouldn't have even been a matter for vote at this time. It is not the role of the U.S. Congress to interpose itself with the will of the voters who spoke on November 3rd, not on January 6th. But notwithstanding that, I think that, you look at the incredible unified response from the judiciary at all levels: state courts, federal district courts, federal appeals courts, state Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, Republican appointed justices, Democratic judges, 60 lawsuits. They stood up very clearly and said, this is garbage, and threw it out. And thank goodness, the American people. Donald Trump lost election by 7 million votes. Not only that, he is the first incumbent president of the United States since Herbert Hoover to have lost the presidency, the Senate, and the House. Okay, so this is in fact a decisive resolution of the Trump era. For 4 years, I've been saying to people, well, we don't know how it ends. Well, I don't know what's going to happen the next week, but, knock on wood. But the bottom line is we actually do know that the American people and our system of government not only held up, but has spoken in a very loud way. And you could see, in fact, in the roar of the mob, the lashing out of the defeated. And so, that is something that's important. I need to say this to myself as well, as terrifying and awful as this is. And it truly is, I think, almost an unthinkable attack on our system. Notwithstanding that, people have the opportunity every day to make a difference. And that includes these Republican members of Congress. It's never too late to do the right thing. A lot of people are very mad at Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence for 4 years of enabling this madness. And, I think they need to answer to history and many others for it. But you know what? I bet every single person on this call is also grateful for the fact that they finally did do the right thing when it really counted. And so, that's what I would leave you with. It's never too late to do the right thing, and it's never too late to be involved. And a lot of people have realized that, I think, in the last 4 years.
Well, thank you both for acknowledging the audience that is looking in, and I want to do that as well. It is great to know that a lot of people are out there, that they want to know about these things, and they want to be also challenging about it, as the questions suggested. But Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, it's just been wonderful to have you both on for this length of time. Thank you both very much for doing it. And once again, I hope to see more of you in the near future, and I'm sure I will on television. Come join me as well when the time comes. Next week, it's going to be Dr. Barbara Ferrer, who of course is the expert in public health in the county of Los Angeles. She will be interviewed by Larry Mantle, and that will be at 5 p.m. That's on Wednesday, January 13th. In the meantime, thanks to everybody for being here tonight.